So let's start. So welcome to the webinar, how to rent your home in the Netherlands or in the south of the Netherlands in this case. What are we focusing on? We are focusing on a little bit more about ELN, so about us and of course the process. We're talking a little bit more about renting versus selling and what the rules and regulations are, and the ideal tenant, and we'll talk a little bit about the latest news and the different contract types. Now, the last thing we'll talk about is responsibilities, and then of course, if there's any further questions that are outstanding, we'll be happy to answer them. I am known for maybe sometimes speaking a little bit too fast. So in case that happens, don't hesitate to just share something in the chat and ask me to either say it again or speak a little bit slower. I'll try and be mindful of that throughout the presentation. Please be mindful that the presentation will be recorded and will be shared as well. So you'll get this in your inbox, so no need to take big notes. Let's introduce ourselves though. My name is Kimo. I'm the founder of Expat Letting Network and Expat Housing Network. We've been around for about 8 years now. Almost a decade. Time is flying when you're having fun. And the reason why we're having a great time is not only because we have wonderful clients that we help, but because we have a wonderful team. My colleague Giovanna, living in Eindhoven, is letting consultant and will be able to help you out with renting out your property. And the let is for the more western northern region in case you have property somewhere else. So please be aware that you might meet one of these ladies, depending, of course, where you want to rent out your property. Now, what do? We actually find you a tenant and make sure that the tenant is proper, is enjoying the property, and you are enjoying the tenant. The most important thing in this part of the process, and actually the whole service, is that we care, right? We don't believe it's a transaction. It should be an experience, because the better the experience is of you and the tenant, the more likely it is that you'll have a long-term relationship. And that's something that every landlord is looking for down the line. Then transparent pricing. We charge 1 month of rent for our services for finding a tenant. And if you were looking for a property management services, then we charge 5% of the monthly rent for that. We of course look for quality tenants. We have a very big network, and we are able to find the best quality tenants. Of course, that is to some extent subjective, right? Maybe you have preferences for what you'd be looking for. But for us, the most important thing is that you're happy with the tenant and that the tenant is happy with you and the property as well. And then for us, support doesn't stop when the key is handed over. That's also when we see a lot of the support being offered by us is the first couple of weeks after somebody's moved in. And of course, if you decide to go for a property management package, then you'll receive support thereafter as well. Where do we operate? So in the south, in the west, and a little bit in the north as well. So in case you have any properties in any of these areas, and please be mindful that the radius around these areas is 20 to 30 kilometers, right? Maybe sometimes even further. So we cover a quite large extent to quite large size of the Netherlands. Now, how does the service work? First of all, we of course would love to meet you, and we'd love to meet your property as well. We need to come in and get a better feel for the property, see if there's anything that needs to be done, taken care of before it's actually listed. Well, when that is taken care of and the service level agreement has been signed, then we actually come in and take photos of the property and promote the property online. We'll publish it on different listing websites, and we'll also send it to our network. Then, of course, we'll take care of the viewing. So any requests coming in, we'll screen the tenants and make sure that the right tenants go through the viewings. And then if there's any offers that will be subjected or submitted, then we'll review those as well. And of course, we'll discuss them with you prior to accepting. Once accepted, then we'll take care of the contract. We'll draft the contract, and we'll make sure that everyone knows what they're signing for, that the deposit and the rent is paid on time, and that will be there for the handover. The handover is an important moment, because that's the moment where the keys are offered to the tenant, but also where an inspection report is drafted or created. The inspection report is key because it will actually show the state of the property that it's in once the key is delivered. And this will also be leading when you rent or when the tenant leaves the property again, because then you'll compare, okay, what's the condition of the property when they leave and what was the condition when they moved in. Now, once the key's been handed over, then often we still give support for the first 2 weeks. If there's no property management package, if there is, then we can continue to give support throughout the whole rental period. That means that we manage the rent income. So make sure that the rent is paid on time. We manage any of the maintenance request, we're the point of contact for the tenant, and so on. We manage the vendors. So there is a lot of hassle that we take out of your hands. And we see, especially for people that have busy lives or are living abroad, that this is a useful service to have. Now, renting versus selling. What are the pros and cons of renting versus selling? Well, if you sell your property, please be mindful that you have kind of like some capital, especially if you, of course, made a bit of profit around that. There's no capital gains tax. So let's say you bought your property for 300 grand and you sell your property for 340 grand. Then the 40 grand that you've made is not taxable. So you don't have to pay tax of that. Also, you don't have to have any maintenance. So the property that you used to own had maintenance on it, but no longer do you have to worry about maintaining that property. What are some of the cons? But in a cooling market, you might want to bridge the gap between breaking even or making a loss and getting to that point where you make a little bit of profit again. Also with regards to wealth tax, when you do have a large kind of like profit of the property, then at some point you have to pay wealth tax. And of course, there's no passive income, right? So the money's not working for you anymore. It is sitting passively somewhere, and there's no income generated from it, unless you, of course, invested, but that also comes with risks. Now, if you look at the pros and cons of renting, then the pros of renting is passive income, right? So somebody's actually paying your property and your mortgage as well. You are also able to bridge a cooling market, right? So if, for example, now we're seeing that the market is slowing down a little bit and prices are dropping a little bit, nothing too crazy, right? It's just a correction because COVID was a little bit bad. So you'll actually be able to bridge that time between now and when the market will continue to go up again. Please be mindful, I've never heard anybody say, oh, I'm so happy I didn't buy a house 20 years ago. So that is good to be mindful of. Also, you build up equity, like I mentioned, the mortgage pays off or gets paid off by the actual tenant. Now, if you look at the cons, of course, you are responsible for the property, right? So maintenance is a responsibility. You also have other responsibilities, and we'll dive into those a little bit deeper later in the presentation. And there is no mortgage rebate scheme. So what you currently have is when you own a property, you live in it, then the interest that you pay off your mortgage, you can deduct that from your taxable income. So that is a nice benefit to have. That will disappear once you actually rent out your property. Also, tenants are very well protected. So that means that the tenant builds up tenancy protection, and at some point it becomes very difficult to evict from the property. Now, if you have a good relationship with the tenant, that's where we come in. That is not necessary, of course. And the majority of the tenants stay, maybe after 4 or 5 years, decide to buy anyways. Now, what are some of the rules and regulations? First of all, we'll talk a little bit more about approval. Who do you need approval from? We'll talk about regulated or deregulated housing permit. I've actually removed from the slides. This morning I didn't remove it here, I see. And sharing permit, we'll discuss a little bit about that. Approval is important because technically the mortgage provider owns your home until the last cent of your mortgage has been paid off. Well, they don't technically own your home, but they have certain rights in the mortgage deed that state that you can't rent it out without permission, right? Approval is therefore required from the mortgage provider. Now, if you go away for a short period of time, so let's say you want to rent out your property for 12 months, some mortgage providers actually approve this within the current mortgage they're in. But the majority of the mortgage providers, they say, okay, hey, you have to change your mortgage type, right? So you have to close your current mortgage and open up a new mortgage, which is a investment mortgage, which allows you to rent out your property. There are certain pros and cons to that, though. So please talk to a mortgage provider, or talk to us, or talk to a mortgage provider or mortgage broker to get a little more information about that. Sometimes if you own an apartment and it's part of an owner association, then you also need to check the bylaws to see if you can rent it out. There have been properties in the past that we've seen that are not allowed to rent out. It's very clearly stated in the owner association bylaws. So please be mindful of that. By the way, if there's any questions, don't hesitate to pop them in the Q&A or in the chat. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about regulated versus deregulated. So what's important is that in the Netherlands, we use a point system. What does that mean? Well, the government wants to regulate a certain amount of the housing stock to make sure that it's not overpriced and that people that earn maybe a little bit less can actually pay for this, for these properties. So what do? They said, okay, hey, we're going to attribute a certain amount of points of value to a property. Well, the points, and let me maybe skip to the last points. The point system works as follows. So let's say you have a property and there's certain things that give you an amount of points. So the size, the value attributed by the government, the energy efficiency, luxury. Do you have like a sink, or do you have like a mixing tap? Do you have like a kitchen counter that's longer than 2 meters? Do you have a bathtub? All these things give you points. And if you make the threshold of 149 points, anything above that, it means that you can decide whatever you want in terms of the rent price. However, if you don't meet the 149 points, then it means that you are regulated. So you can only charge a maximum amount of rent. By the way, this is a base rent price, right? So you can still add service costs and utilities on top of that. But the base rent for 149 points is 808 euros. So this is something good to be mindful of. So double check if you're a deregulated or a regulated rental property. I know by heart that a lot of the properties that are being rented out in the area are not necessarily aware of this, but it's good to be mindful of, because if the tenant does say, hey, you're charging too much money for this property, then he can actually contest it. And I think they have 6 months to do that. After the first 6 months, they can no longer do that. Sharing property, sharing permit. So what is important is that if you have like multiple bedrooms in the property and you have more than 2 people that share or more than 2 people from a different household that share this property, then technically you need a sharing permit, because the government or the municipality doesn't want to have too many kind of like roomed up houses in this case. So they want to control the housing stock to a certain extent. So what is important when requesting this permit is that there's no kind of like other property in an area of 30 meters or raised 30 meters that has also requested this necessarily. Also, you need to apply with certain installation norms and fire safety as well. The size of the rooms is important, and the tenants need to have an individual contract. So if you have a bigger property and you want to rent out to multiple people that are not from the same household, so let's say you have a couple and they have invited a friend to move in with them, right? Then that technically is 2 households, because yeah, the couple is 1 household and the friend is another household. Now, let's talk a little bit about the ideal tenant. When it comes to the ideal tenant, there's a couple of things that we always look at. Household, of course. Are you looking for a family? Are you looking for a single? Are you looking for couples? And pets, very important, of course. Do you want to have pets in your property or not? This could be a cat, a dog, or we had a giant African snail once. Very important to be mindful of these things and to decide whatever you're looking for. Income is also important. We also use a rule of thumb with 3 times the rent. So what does that mean? That the income of the tenant has to be at least 3 times the monthly rent, and that has to be gross income, right? Because we say 1/3 goes to tax, 1/3 goes to rent, 1/3 goes to living. That's a very rough calculation, by the way. So the more they earn, the more will go to tax, but it's good to be mindful of that. Also, work contract. If a contract is about to expire, then it's something we need to be mindful of and on the declaration of the employer. And if it's an indefinite contract, it gives you a little bit more security. Then if there's any other things, right, that are important for you, what kind of tenant are you looking for? We try and get like a bit of a profile of the tenant in to get them to know a little bit better. If you want to actually meet up with them before making a decision, that could also be an option. Could be somewhat time consuming, but in the end, it's important that every party feels at ease in the process. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the latest news, and this becomes a little bit technical. So maybe let me start on the right side. People often ask us, like, how do I calculate my actual income over a rental property, right? So there's a couple of ways of doing this. First of all, you, of course, declare your rental income. Then the government, what they do is they approach this as follows. They say, okay, hey, we have to attribute a certain amount of wealth that you have with the property that you own, right? And that's considered the wealth part. Over that wealth, we say that you make a standard percentage of yield, which is kind of like your income, because they don't want to calculate it based on every different property. Over that yield, you pay wealth tax. And then you have the mortgage cost, which is here. So this is the income. These are the costs, and this is the net income, right? So what I'm going to disclose now or share a little bit are the rules for 2023, because the vacant value ratio, this is kind of like the amount of wealth the government considers you to have in the property. Used to be 65%, but is now 95%. So let's say the government gives the property a certain value, let's say 300,000 euros. Then what they say is that 95% of the value of that property, because we're talking about the WZ value, is considered wealth. Now, Then they look at, oh, there should have been a space here, the yield. So based on kind of like the amount of wealth you have in the property, what is the actual income or expected income that you'd have on that property? Well, they consider that now to be 6.17%. So 6.17% over the actual attributed wealth is counted towards standard yields. Now, over this amount, you pay 32% tax. Now, what's also good to know is that you, of course, have mortgage costs. Well, in the past, also what used to be the case is that this amount of wealth, you can deduct the actual value of the mortgage of this, right? So how much debt do you still have outstanding? That is no longer the case. It's a little bit more complex calculation around that, but this means that you just have to make a proper calculation, right, to make sure if it's still worth it to rent it out. I consider that for the majority of the properties that are in the private sector, it's still definitely worth it. And also bearing in mind that somebody is still paying off your mortgage, right? So it's a very interesting way of saving. Now, what are some of the new rules? The new rules means that, and by the way, this is not set in stone yet, so please be mindful of this, because they have, I think they have a conversation in the government next week about this, because the government wants to regulate the housing market a little bit more. So they were planning on increasing the point system change to 187 points. So that technically means that instead of 149 points being the threshold is increased, and anything below that is regulated rent. What does that mean? That if it makes it to 187, then the maximum rent for properties up to 187 points is 1,026 euros starting in 2024. Now, we often get a question, but if I rent my property out this year and somebody is staying for indefinite, do I still have to change the price next year? No, the rules for this year apply, right? So my suggestion would be try and rent out your property still this year for as long as possible. And then, of course, we don't know exactly what the rules will be starting next year because they're still debating that, right? There's a lot of pushback from the real estate sector. So we'll be able to share a little bit closer to you by the end of the year what the actual new rules and regulations will be. However, if you rent out your property this year to somebody for at least a year or longer, then you don't have to change your pricing suddenly when January 2024 kicks in. Now, there's also one more thing, and that is that the WOZ value used to attribute to a certain amount of points. Now they say, okay, only part of WOZ value will be attributed to the amount of points. Again, something that is a little more technical, but we can actually share. I think we do share the link of how you calculate your points of your property in the newsletter that you'll receive after this webinar. Then we'll talk a little bit about rental contracts. So there's three different types of rental contracts. There's the first one we call Model A contract. The Model A contract is an indefinite rental period. So the tenant can stay for as long as they want, but you can request a minimum term, right? So you can say, okay, you can stay for as long as you want, but I want you to stay at least 12 months. This is what we find often. And the tenant has protection from the start, and the tenant has notice period equaling one payment period. So if you charge them rent month to month, then their notice period is one calendar month. Please be mindful that they cannot exercise that in that minimum period, right? That you declare with them, but afterwards they actually have the right to leave with one calendar month's notice. Now, you have Model B. There's a temporary rental contract, and it's a contract up to 24 months, and you cannot request a minimum term here, but you can ask the tenant to leave at the end of the rental contract. So if you're unsure about what the future holds, right, then this is a potential rental contract for you. Maybe you want to move into the property yourself, or maybe you want to sell, or maybe you're not 100% sure about the tenant. Then you can use a Model B contract to make sure it's a temporary rental contract. Please be mindful, though, that the tenant has the right to terminate the contract throughout the rental period, right? So they could leave after 1 or 2 months, right? But they still have a calendar month's notice. And please be mindful that if you extend this contract, it automatically becomes a Model A contract. So you can't say, okay, we're going to enter into a contract for 12 months. At the end of the 12 months, we'll extend it by another 12 months. That is not an option. Now, the last type of rental contract is the Model C contract, which is also a temporary rental contract. However, it's a bit of a deviation from Model B because you can request a minimum term here. Why is that the case? Well, Model C is considered to be a diplomatic contract. This is for people that are actually moving to another country for a specific period of time and they want to rent out their property. Well, I can imagine that you don't want to have the hassle of finding a new tenant after 2 months. So what you can do with this contract is state that the tenant has to stay for a minimum term. However, you have to state clearly in this contract that you'll be needing the property back when you move back again. If you're moving in with your friend or with your partner, this is not a reason to use a Model C contract, right? So it's very much for you're leaving the country or you're doing something for a year, you're traveling for a year, and then you need the property back after that year, then you can use it. The Model C contract can be extended for another similar term, and the notice period is equal to 1 payment period. Now, last but not least, your responsibilities as a landlord. First of all, minor, major repairs. Minor repairs, the responsibility of the tenant. Major repairs, responsibility of the landlord. We always use a rule of thumb, which is kind of like if it's below 50 euros and it doesn't require a specialist, then it's often the responsibility of the tenant. But there is actually a very clear document that states what your responsibilities are as a landlord. And this is infrastructural. This is things that die of old age. This is the more specific matters that require specialists or are a little more expensive to fix. However, if the tenant damaged it or broke it, then it's of course the responsibility of the tenant. Now, then you also have responsibility with regards to the notice period. So whenever you give notice, and this can only be done in a Model B contract and a Model C contract, you also have to give notice, even though they're both temporary contracts. You cannot do it sooner than 3 months and no later than 1 month. So please be mindful of that. If you forget about this, and this is where we come in, right? So we can actually remind you, if you forget about this, then the tenant can actually stay for an indefinite period if it's a Model B contract. So please be mindful of this. We've had one case, well, not under our management, but we found an apartment for somebody. And then we heard from the landlady that she had a big issue with the previous tenant because they didn't want to leave. So please be mindful of that. You also have responsibilities if you have an apartment towards the VVE, right? So you have to make sure that the tenant acknowledges and honors the rules and regulations of the VVE. And of course, if there's other taxation matters, then you have to be responsible for that. Registration, very important thing. So some landlords still try to get the tax rebate scheme by staying registered at the property. However, if you get called out on it by the municipality, then you could actually either find yourself with having to evict tenants if that's impossible, or maybe even the mortgage provider finds out. So please be mindful of those things. I've breezed through the presentation, I see. I hope I didn't speak too fast. Please do feel free to reach out for an intake. We'll send you an email with the link as well. We're happy to share a little bit more and discuss a little bit more in private, kind of like your specific case. So far, are there any questions? You know where to find us. Book a call. Giovanna is not one that bites, so she is a lovely person. So please do. Please do reach out.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Questions, send an email. We'll be here. Thank you.